Hello class and welcome back. Today I'm kicking off another something new. This is a series of short study guide videos built around challenge questions. These aren't the straightforward recall questions you see on most of my weekly quizzes. These are the ones that make you, pause, think, and connect ideas across the course, and sometimes say, wait a minute, did he pull this from the next lecture? And well, yes, yes I did. And that is on purpose. Before we dive in, I want to give you a quick overview of how these challenge questions are designed, because it's going to help you study smarter and actually retain this material better long term. So we're going to introduce this concept of Bloom's taxonomy. Bloom's taxonomy is basically a way of describing different levels of thinking, from simple recall all the way up to deeper analysis and evaluation. It's basically the explaining why a question has this answer and not just what the answer is. At the base level, you've got things like just remembering and understanding. Facts, definitions, key concepts, kind of boring stuff. Most of the types of questions you get on your basic science courses that you take. In the middle, you start applying and analyzing, using information in real scenarios, comparing patterns, interpreting data, things like that. And then at the top, you're evaluating and sometimes even creating. Those are harder to do, but we do get up to the evaluate level in Bloom's taxonomy in some of these questions. This is where you're making judgments, solving open-ended problems, and really integrating ideas in ways that feel a lot like clinical or coaching decisions. Here is the pyramid of Bloom's taxonomy, and as you can see, we start at the bottom, just simply remembering something. Read something in a textbook, hear it in lecture, and just reproduce it on a test. It's not really a deep understanding of the material. And as you move up into level 2, level 3, where you're starting to apply, level 4, analyze, and the top level in most courses, evaluate, that is the hardest level, but you get the most understanding of the material. In open-ended type questions, that's the final step, level 6. We don't really do that in this format on the video, but that's where you just create your own work, and that is true mastery of the material. So, the challenge questions in this series are basically designed to hit those higher levels up in the pyramid. Not just because the quizzes or exams require it, but your future work in healthcare or exercise physiology or anatomy will. Whether you're, training an athlete, or you're evaluating a patient, or maybe deciding how to modify a rehab program in my field of work, you're not going to be asked, what's the definition of VO2 max? It's just not going to happen. You're going to be applying that physiology to real world situations. Now, some of these questions will intentionally pull ideas in from lectures you might not have seen yet. This is by design, and this is a technique called interleaving, right? It's mixing concepts to help your brain build stronger connections. It also taps into that spaced repetition theory, which is really one of the most effective ways to remember a lot of complex information. I used that concept quite a bit when I was in school. So don't worry if a question feels a little ahead of where you are, and that's the point. Let it hopefully spark that curiosity and prime your brain for the next lecture that's coming. So here's a picture of the concept of interleaving. So for example, on the top right here, if you go through one day of a study block and all you do is study concept A, and then day 2 you switch to concept B, and then day 3 concept C, of course you get the point. By day 4, after your 4th day of studying and you're on to the 4th chapter in the text, you can't remember anything from chapter 1 because you've just gone through it and you haven't done spaced repetition or this interleaving concept, which is what the bottom is, where you get little pieces of it and you get this spaced repetition and you get better and learn it more. That's how we design a lot of our courses, at least how I try to do it in my anatomy class and physiology class, where we keep tapping into that cumulative interleaving concept. So again, you're not expected to know everything, just to be able to think about the question and try to reason through it. So as you follow along, just don't try to get the right answer. Instead, focus on why the reasoning works and think about what would change if the scenario changed. That's real exercise physiology in action, or anatomy in action. So please try, work through the struggle. It's part of the learning process. So let's get into it. Here are your first challenge questions, and just remember a little that productive struggle goes a long way in mastering this material. All right, so here we go. Question 1. A runner increases speed from an easy jog to a moderate run. Which variable increases earliest and most proportionally? And you have your choices there: stroke volume, heart rate, AVO2 difference, and blood lactate. Pause if you need it. Get to the answer right now. And the answer is B, and it's heart rate. And this is an example of that analyzed right up to that level 4 Bloom's taxonomy here. Stroke volume improves early in exercise, but it certainly hits a ceiling quickly in most people. The AVO2 difference, that reflects metabolic demand, and that increases a little more slowly. But heart rate, however, which is controlled by a quick parasympathetic withdrawal, shoots up very quickly and climbs, well, proportionally with exercise intensity. This is why that is the correct answer. I like to throw in a little fun facts. If you know me and my way of teaching, I love fun facts. Your heart rate can certainly jump up very quickly right when you start exercise, and noticeably a lot quicker before your breathing can catch up. And I've noticed that too. We have a very sharp hill right out of the gate when I leave my community, and man, my heart rate goes up, but I'm not really breathing hard yet. Question 2. There's 10 questions, by the way. 2 athletes have identical VO2 max, but athlete A hits lactate threshold at 60% VO2 max and athlete B at 80%. Who sustains a faster 10K? Athlete A, athlete B, both are equal, or not enough info? Pause if you need it. And the answer is B, athlete B. And that is another evaluate level of Bloom's taxonomy. And here, higher lactate threshold means athlete B can hold a faster pace longer before fatigue sets in, even if both athletes have the identical same VO2 max. The lactate threshold is one of the best predictors of endurance performance, and this is what we're going to go over in class. If you're starting this in conjunction with my exercise physiology class and we're in week 1, you may not be familiar with all these terms yet, but we're introducing them now so you get comfortable with it, and when it comes up, you'll be like, aha, I remember that, and you'll remember it better. Really neat thing is these amazing superhuman athletes can bring their lactate threshold up to about 80 or even 90% of their VO2 max, and they can hold that for 2+ hours in a marathon. It's ridiculous. Question 3. During high intensity intervals, why does ventilation rise disproportionately more than VO2, or your O2, your ventilation, your O2 consumption? A, to increase alveolar stretch to get more air in. B, to cool the body. C, to buffer rising CO2 from lactate buffering. Or D, to maintain blood pressure. Answer is C, to buffer that rising CO2. And this, while it might be a deep in the weeds biochemistry answer, is really only at that level 2 as well. You just have to remember this equation right there, and then you'll be able to get this answer. So high intensity glycolysis is going to boost a lot of lactic acid. That lactic acid, my face is kind of in the way here, breaks up into lactate right here and H+. That H+ starts to raise this side of this equation in biochemistry from your carbonic acid breaking down to H+ and bicarbonate. And that's going to drive this equation this direction to create more H2O, which your body can handle, and CO2, which your body can't handle. So buffering all that H+ coming from the lactate with bicarbonate creates a lot of extra CO2, and that causes ventilation to spike to blow off that CO2 to get it out so you don't go into acidosis. And that's going to cause ventilation to spike much more than oxygen consumption. And this creates the ventilatory threshold. And the fun fact here is your ventilation can go up 5 to 7 times during hard intervals compared to your VO2 itself, my face is in the way again, which only goes up 2 to 3 times. Question 4. A cyclist stands instead of sitting, going up a tough hill, for example, but still maintains the same power output on their power meter on the bike. Why does heart rate spike then? And the options are A, decreased cardiac preload, B, increased muscular recruitment, C, lower respiratory efficiency, and D, higher pedal torque. Again, these might be hard. Try to reason through it. Try and see if you can find the correct answer in there, which is Yeah, B, increased muscular recruitment. What's going on here is standing recruits upper body and a lot of your stabilizer muscles in your core, which is going to inevitably raise whole body oxygen demand, even if the bike shows the same wattage. More metabolic demand results in more cardiovascular demand, which results in a higher heart rate. So there you go. You can reason your way through this. Fun fact here, and I know this from personal experience, standing, climbing up up a hill on your bike can increase your VO2 by quite a bit. 10% seems like a conservative estimate compared to sitting. That's why everyone says as soon as you start going up that hill, stay down on your bike. Do not stand, even though you think it's going to help. You're going to blow up and burn and just kind of crash and burn off in the bushes if you try to stand up that hill. Question 5, halfway through. An athlete has more type 1 fibers in their gastroc than in their quadriceps. Therefore, which activity suits them better? And again, this might be farther than what we've covered in lecture 1 and 2, but the options are flat sprinting, so flat ground sprinting, uphill running, Olympic lifting, or repeat sprints, like 200-meter sprint intervals. And the answer is going to be uphill running. And this is going to be an apply level, like apply the knowledge that you've learned to this question, a level 3. Uphill running demands, so to speak, sustained but yet oxidative effort, not glycolysis. You need a lot of oxidation, you need a lot of oxygen going up a slow, steady hill. That is perfect for type 1 fibers. Sprinting, by contrast, depends on type 2, fast twitch power. So we're going to cover this all in this course as you progress through, but that is why this answer is correct. The soleus, which is right underneath the gastroc, is often very high in type 1 in most people, often 80 or 90%. And why some, you'll see them, lifelong endurance athletes, they can just keep going. They can do a marathon, they're like, I can do more. And there are people that do double marathons, right? Ultra marathons, because they can just keep going. They have these indestructible calves, because they're likely lucky to have a very high proportion of type 1 fibers, and they can just keep on running. Question 6. Why does heart rate drift upward during prolonged moderate exercise, even at a steady workload? And is it A, increasing VO2, B, rising stroke volume, C, reduced plasma volume plus thermoregulation, or D, increased oxygen extraction? This one might be a little tough. Answer is C, reduced plasma volume combined with thermoregulation. And this, even though it might sound complex, is actually only a step above the remember. This is an understand concept. As you sweat and send more blood to the skin for cooling in the evaporation component of sweat, your stroke volume is inevitably going to decrease. Your heart rate, therefore, has to rise to maintain that cardiac output. And this phenomenon is called cardiac drift. And I do have another video where I kind of go through that on the bike in this exercise phys in action kind of video where we explain cardiac drift a little bit more. It's a neat concept, but it's amazing when it happens. Question 7. Why might an elite marathoner run with a lower RER at race pace than a recreational runner? And the options are they rely more on anaerobic metabolism, they have more mitochondria and fat oxidation capacity, they use less oxygen, or their muscles are smaller. And again, this might be hard. Try to reason through it. Try to figure out where the answer is. And the answer is B, greater mitochondrial density. This one's a hard one. That's why it's all the way up in the analyzed level of Bloom's taxonomy. Elite athletes burn more fat at higher intensities, and therefore they're going to spare glycogen and keep, as a result, their RER, the respiratory exchange ratio, lower, even at higher absolute speeds. And this is what is so cool about training adaptations and how you can train your body and go through this adaptation that I just found so fascinating when I was in your shoes and learning exercise phys as a college student, going all through these training adaptations and watching how my body changed. It is pretty neat. Fun fact here, some elite runners can burn 50% fat at 80% of VO2 max. So they're still burning a significant amount of fat, even at speeds that I would consider ridiculous, but they're just cruising along, where kind of untrained and recreational athletes can't even do at 50% of VO2 max. It is pretty fascinating stuff. Question 8. A student's resting heart rate is 58 beats per minute, and their max heart rate is 190. What percent of heart rate reserve is 150? Options are 50, 60, 70, or 80. This is fairly straightforward here. The answer is 70. This uses the Karvonen method to calculate training intensity. And it's just basic math that you see on the screen here. 70% heart rate reserve roughly equates to about a mid-zone 3 level of exercise intensity, FYI. Heart rate reserve actually correlates better with metabolic zones than just a raw percentage of your heart rate max, which is often what is used when you plug in your info onto a treadmill in the gym, and especially more so in trained athletes. So I did another video on this when I was on Fiesta Island in San Diego, if you know where that is. It's a kind of a classic cyclist and runners kind of training paradise because it's a nice loop. And we talk about that more in another video. Question 9. VO2 plateaus during a test, and yet the participant's heart rate continues to rise. Why? This is like a Jeopardy question here. You got to think about it. A, VO2 max has been reached, but heart rate max, not yet. B, they had a poor effort. C, their blood pressure spiked, so they had to heart rate changed concordantly. Or D, there's a respiratory limitation here. Pause, think about it. Answer is A, their VO2 max reached the peak, but their heart rate did not. So the situation here, VO2 max indicates max oxygen consumption. Heart rate, however, continues to rise due to a lot of other issues, neural and hormonal stimulation. You got a whole bunch of adrenaline going through your system, so your heart rate keeps going up, but you have reached your VO2 max. Essentially your metabolic limit has been hit, but your heart rate keeps going up. Interestingly, and this is very annoying when you're trying to do research, some athletes just never really show a true VO2 plateau even at maximum effort, and frustratingly they're just called non-plateau responders. They really are the people that just kind of mess up the data because you want such clean data in exercise phys, and life is not like that sometimes. All right, last question. 2 athletes run at the same pace, but one reports much higher rate of perceived exertion. Why? A, lower heart rate. B, higher anaerobic contribution. C, lower body temperature. Or D, better running economy. And the answer is B, higher anaerobic contribution. So if one athlete is relying more on anaerobic metabolism, they accumulate more lactate and hydrogen ions, which contributes to a lot of fatigue, a lot of exhaustion, and increased effort, increased perceived effort, or your RPE, your rate of perceived exertion. So this is another neat one, and we're going to talk about this throughout the course. The fascinating thing, this simple metric, your rate of perceived exertion from 1 to 10, or there's other ones that go, I think, 5 to like 18 or 20, Borg's rate of perceived exertion. It's such a simple, almost dumb sounding tool, but it correlates very strongly to blood lactate, which is kind of the gold standard of lactate accumulation. Even in beginners, you don't have to be a trained athlete, so it really does work. All right, that's it. Hope you enjoyed these questions. Going to have more for you as the weeks progress, and good luck in the class.